The coffee cup slipped from Hank Morrison's weathered hands, shattering against the porch floor as three massive German shepherds emerged from the darkness like avenging angels. Marcus Webb stood frozen, gasoline can trembling in his grip, his face drained of color as the dog's golden eyes reflected the porch light with predatory intensity. This wasn't how it was supposed to end. Sheriff Bradley's radio crackled to life, his voice breaking as he called for backup while neighbors poured from their houses, children screaming at the sight of blood pooling beneath the 75-year-old man's crumpled frame. The largest dog, Rex, positioned himself protectively over Hank's body, a low growl rumbling from deep within his chest. Dorothy's wedding ring glinted on Hank's finger, the same hand that had bottle-fed these same dogs as helpless puppies 3 years ago. Now they towered over 6 feet on their hind legs, no longer the abandoned orphans he'd saved from certain death. "Sweet Jesus," Webb whispered, backing toward his truck. How did they know? What force had brought these loyal guardians home at the exact moment their savior needed them most? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 3 years earlier, the Georgia sun filtered through the lace curtains of Hank Morrison's kitchen window, casting gentle shadows across the breakfast table where he sat alone with his morning coffee. At 72, the retired English teacher had perfected the art of solitude, though it never quite felt natural. He still set 2 plates each morning, a habit that died hard after 53 years of marriage, then quietly returned Dorothy's to the cupboard, with the same careful reverence he'd shown her memory for the past 12 years. The 5-acre homestead in Millbrook County had once buzzed with the laughter Dorothy brought to every corner. Now it whispered with her absence. Her garden still bloomed each spring under Hank's devoted care. Her favorite rocking chair remained positioned to catch the afternoon light, and her photograph smiled down from the mantelpiece, surrounded by the life they'd built together but never quite completed. Dorothy had always wanted children. The doctor's explanations had been clinical and final, but her maternal heart never fully accepted defeat. Instead, she'd poured that boundless love into her students, neighborhood strays, and anyone who needed nurturing. Hank often caught himself talking to her photograph, sharing the small details of his days as if she might respond with that musical laugh that had first captured his heart at a church social in 1968. His Social Security check of $1,347 arrived each month like clockwork, covering the modest mortgage payment, utilities, and groceries, with little left over for luxuries. The wedding ring on his finger had grown loose over the years, sliding around as his hands had grown thinner. But he'd never considered removing it. Some bonds transcended physical presence. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 6 o'clock, marking another quiet evening in a string of quiet evenings. Hank's daily routine had become a meditation of sorts, morning coffee while reading Dorothy's favorite Bible verses, tending her vegetable garden, preparing simple meals for one, and settling into his worn recliner with the evening news. His blue eyes, still sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses, often drifted to the empty spaces where a different kind of life might have unfolded. Hidden in Dorothy's memory box, tucked beneath their wedding album, lay a faded dog collar from her childhood pet, a German shepherd named Duke. She'd often spoken of that dog's unwavering loyalty, how he'd waited by her bedroom door during childhood illnesses and walked her to school each morning. "Dogs love with their whole hearts," she used to say, stroking pictures of Duke in her old photo albums. No conditions, no expectations, just pure devotion. Hank's weathered hands traced the rim of his coffee cup as another evening settled over the homestead. He had no way of knowing that tomorrow would bring an interruption to his carefully ordered solitude, one that would awaken parts of his heart he'd thought permanently dormant. The knock on Hank's front door came just as the evening news was ending, sharp and urgent against the settling quiet of another solitary night. Visitors were rare enough in daylight hours, almost unheard of after 8 o'clock. Hank set down his reading glasses and shuffled to the window, peering through Dorothy's sheer curtains at the familiar pickup truck parked in his gravel driveway. Dr. Jake Sullivan stood on the porch, his veterinary clinic jacket rumpled and stained, cradling a cardboard box against his chest like precious cargo. Even in the dim porch light, Hank could see the exhaustion etched across the young man's face. Jake had been one of his brightest students 15 years ago, a serious boy who'd always known he wanted to heal animals. Now 35, he ran the only veterinary practice in 3 counties, carrying the weight of every creature's suffering on his shoulders. "Evening, Mr. Morrison," Jake said, as Hank opened the door. "I'm sorry to bother you so late, but I didn't know where else to turn." The box in his arms shifted slightly, accompanied by the faintest whimpering sound that tugged at something deep in Hank's chest. "What have you got there, son?" Hank asked, though his heart was already beginning to understand before his mind caught up. Jake's shoulders sagged with relief at not being turned away immediately. 3 German Shepherd puppies, maybe 6 weeks old, found their mama behind the Walmart this morning, poisoned. Whoever did it used antifreeze, made sure she suffered. His voice cracked slightly on the last words. These little ones were hiding in the storm drain, scared half to death and barely alive. Hank felt his resolve wavering as another soft whimper emerged from the box. "Jake, I'm 72 years old. I don't know the first thing about raising puppies, especially ones that young." "Surely the county shelter's been at capacity for 2 months, Jake interrupted, desperation creeping into his voice. "Atlanta rescue groups are overwhelmed, and these babies need round-the-clock care for at least another month. Bottle feeding every 3 hours, temperature regulation, constant monitoring. I've been caring for them at the clinic for 3 days, but I can't keep them there much longer." The box shifted again, and Jake adjusted his grip. "Mr. Morrison, I remember what you used to tell us in English class about taking care of the words that couldn't speak for themselves. These puppies, they can't speak for themselves either." Hank's throat tightened at the reference to his old teaching philosophy. Dorothy had always teased him about bringing home every stray student who needed extra attention, just as she'd done with wounded animals. "That's different, Jake. Those were teenagers, not helpless creatures that could die if I make a mistake." Mrs. Morrison would have taken them in a heartbeat, Jake said quietly, playing his trump card with surgical precision. The truth of it hit Hank like a physical blow. Dorothy would have already cleared out the laundry room, warmed towels in the dryer, and started mixing formula before Jake had finished explaining the situation. She'd have named them before their first feeding, assigned each one a distinct personality, and loved them as fiercely as if they'd been born to her. "Let me see them," Hank heard himself saying, stepping back to allow Jake inside. In the warm light of the living room, Jake carefully opened the cardboard box. 3 tiny bundles of black and tan fur huddled together, their eyes barely open, ears still folded against their heads. The largest, a male with distinctive golden eyes, lifted his head weakly at the sound of voices. A smaller female with intelligent dark eyes remained alert but cautious, while the third puppy, clearly the runt, slept curled against his siblings. "This big fellow here seems to be the protector," Jake explained, gently stroking the largest puppy's head. "He's been keeping watch over the other 2 since I found them. The little girl is sharp as a tack, already responding to her name when I call. And this little guy," he indicated the smallest, "has the biggest personality of the 3 when he's awake." Hank found himself kneeling beside the box, his arthritic joints protesting the sudden movement. The largest puppy's golden eyes fixed on his face with startling intensity, as if measuring the stranger's worthiness. Something passed between them in that moment, a recognition that transcended species or circumstance. "What would I call them?" Hank asked, the question escaping before he could stop it. Jake's face brightened with the first smile Hank had seen from him all evening. That big protector there looks like a Rex to me. The smart little lady could be Bella, and this curious troublemaker." He lifted the smallest puppy, who immediately began exploring Jake's fingers with a pink tongue. "He's definitely a Scout." Rex, Bella, and Scout. The names felt right, settling into Hank's heart like they'd been waiting there all along. Dorothy would have approved, he thought, remembering her childhood stories about Duke and the unwavering loyalty of German shepherds. "I'll need supplies," Hank said finally, surrendering to the inevitable. "Formula, bottles, everything they'll need." Jake was already reaching for a bag he'd left by the door. "I brought everything to get you started, plus instructions for feeding schedules and what to watch for. I'll check on you tomorrow, and I'm just a phone call away if you need anything." As Jake prepared to leave, he turned back one final time. "Mr. Morrison, thank you. You're saving 3 lives tonight." Watching the taillights disappear down his driveway, Hank looked down at the box of sleeping puppies and felt something he hadn't experienced in 12 years, the weight of being needed by something other than his own memories. 2 months into what Hank had begun thinking of as his second parenthood, disaster struck with the swift cruelty that life sometimes reserves for its most precious moments. Rex, now the size of a small bear cub with paws that promised future magnificence, had been listless for 2 days. What started as a slight decrease in appetite had escalated into violent vomiting and bloody diarrhea that sent Hank racing to Jake's clinic at dawn on a humid Tuesday morning. "Parvo," Jake said quietly, after examining Rex's weakened form on the steel examination table. The single word fell between them like a death sentence. "It's aggressive, and at his age..." He didn't need to finish. They both knew the statistics. Even with treatment, Puppy's Rex's age had less than a 50% survival rate. Hank's weathered hands trembled as he stroked Rex's fevered head. The puppy's golden eyes, usually bright with mischief and intelligence, were dulled with sickness. His breathing came in shallow pants, and his body temperature had spiked to dangerous levels. "What do we do?" "Aggressive IV fluids, anti-nausea medication, antibiotics to prevent secondary infections." Jake rattled off the treatment plan while preparing an IV line. "Round-the-clock monitoring for the next 48 hours, the critical period." He paused, meeting Hank's eyes. "Mr. Morrison, I have to be honest with you. The treatment alone will cost around $800, and there's no guarantee." "Do it," Hank interrupted without hesitation. $800 represented more than half his monthly Social Security check, money that should go toward utilities, groceries, and the small luxuries that made his fixed income stretch. But looking down at Rex's trusting face, the financial calculation seemed obscene. That afternoon, Hank sat in his truck outside Tommy's pawn shop on Main Street, Dorothy's wedding ring heavy in his palm. The simple gold band had weathered 53 years of marriage, through dishwashing and garden work, through the difficult times when money was tight and the abundant times when love was all they needed. The ring had never left his finger, not even during Dorothy's funeral when well-meaning relatives suggested he move on. The bell above Tommy's door chimed as Hank entered, the sound hollow in the cramped space filled with other people's surrendered treasures. Tommy Kowalski looked up from behind the counter, recognizing Hank immediately. They'd gone to high school together back when Millbrook County was smaller and everyone knew everyone's story. "Hank Morrison," Tommy said, his voice carefully neutral. "What brings you in today?" Hank placed the ring on the counter's glass surface, where it caught the fluorescent light and threw tiny rainbows across a display of old watches. "I need $800, Tommy." "Today." Tommy picked up the ring, examining it through his jeweler's loupe. The silence stretched between them while Hank's heart hammered against his ribs. Finally, Tommy set down the loop and looked up. "This is Dorothy's ring." "It was," Hank confirmed. "Now it's just a piece of metal that might save a life." "What kind of trouble are you in, Hank?" "Not trouble. A puppy with parvo needs treatment I can't afford." The words came out steady, though admitting his financial limitations to a high school classmate stung his pride. Tommy was quiet for a long moment, turning the ring over in his hands. Then he opened his cash register and counted out $800 in 20s and 50s. "Take this," he said, pushing the money across the counter while sliding the ring back toward Hank. "And take this back, too." "Tommy, I can't—" "Dorothy used to substitute teach my grandson when his regular teacher was sick," Tommy interrupted. "Never took a dime for it. Said it was what neighbors did for each other. Consider this a very late thank you." Hank's eyes filled with tears he couldn't hide. "I'll pay you back." "You'll do no such thing. But you will bring that puppy by when he's better, so I can meet him." The next 48 hours blurred together in a haze of vigilance and prayer. Jake had set up a small recovery area in the back of his clinic, and Hank rarely left Rex's side. He slept in an uncomfortable chair, taking shifts with Jake to monitor the IV drip and Rex's vital signs. Bella and Scout, quarantined at home but so far showing no symptoms, were cared for by Jake's assistant. On the second night, as Hank dozed fitfully in his chair, he was awakened by a soft whimper. Rex had lifted his head for the first time in days, his golden eyes focusing with something approaching their usual alertness. When Hank reached out, Rex managed to lick his fingers with a dry but determined tongue. "Dorothy," Hank whispered, not caring that Jake might overhear. "I know you're watching over him. I know you sent him to me." By the third morning, Rex was standing on shaky legs, accepting small amounts of water and bland food. His tail, which had hung limp for days, managed a tentative wag when Hank spoke his name. The crisis had passed, leaving both man and puppy changed by the experience of nearly losing each other. Jake performed one final examination before declaring Rex out of immediate danger. "He's going to make it," he said, unable to hide his own relief. "Full recovery should take another week or two, but the worst is over." As they prepared to take Rex home, Jake pulled Hank aside. "What you did, risking everything for him like that, it's going to create a bond between you two that nothing can break. Dogs remember who fought for them when they couldn't fight for themselves." Driving home with Rex curled weakly in a blanket on the passenger seat, Hank thought about Jake's words. The puppy's trusting presence filled something in him that had been empty since Dorothy's death. For the first time in 12 years, he wasn't just surviving his days, he was living them again. What Hank couldn't know was that his neighbor, Marcus Webb, had been watching the comings and goings from his property line, taking careful note of Hank's obvious attachment to the growing dogs. Webb's expression remained unreadable as he observed the reunion, but his hands clenched into fists at his sides. The late summer heat shimmered off the asphalt as Hank watched Jake's truck disappear down the county road, taking with it the 3 hearts that had become his whole world. Rex sat tall in the truck bed, his golden eyes never leaving Hank's figure until the vehicle crested the hill and vanished from sight. Bella had pressed her nose against the rear window until the last possible moment, while Scout's excited barking had gradually faded into the distance. The silence that followed felt heavier than the humid Georgia air. For the first time in 4 months, Hank's homestead felt empty again. The dogs had transformed every corner of his property into a playground of discovery and joy. Rex's favorite spot under the old oak tree lay vacant, the dirt still pressed down in the shape of his massive frame. Bella's collection of sticks, carefully arranged by the porch steps according to some canine logic only she understood, remained untouched. Scout's latest excavation project near the garden fence stood half-finished, a monument to his boundless curiosity about what treasures might lie beneath Georgia clay. Jake had found good families for each dog, carefully vetted homes where the puppies would have room to grow and children to protect. The Miller family, with their 2 young boys and fenced acreage, had fallen instantly in love with Rex's gentle strength and natural protective instincts. Sarah Chen, a third-grade teacher living alone after her divorce, had recognized Bella's intelligence and planned to train her as a therapy dog for children with learning disabilities. The elderly Hendersons, married 62 years and recently lost their own German Shepherd to old age, had seen Scout's playful spirit as exactly the medicine their quiet house needed. Each placement was perfect, logical, and absolutely right for the dog's futures. Hank had agreed to them all, even encouraged them because he understood what Dorothy would have wanted. Love meant wanting the best for those you cherished, even when that best didn't include you. But understanding and accepting were 2 entirely different creatures, and Hank found himself grieving in ways that surprised him with their intensity. He caught himself listening for the scratch of claws on hardwood floors, the soft, whuffing sounds Rex made when dreaming, the gentle thud of Bella's tail against his chair leg when she settled beside him each evening. 3 times he'd prepared 4 bowls for dinner before remembering he was alone again. The community noticed the change immediately. Millbrook County was small enough that everyone knew about Hank's puppies, and their absence created a visible void in his daily routine. Previously, his trips to the feed store had been social events, with Rex riding shotgun and attracting admirers in the parking lot. His evening walks had included 3 enthusiastic companions who turned simple strolls into adventures of sniffing, exploring, and greeting every neighbor along their route. It was during one of these solitary evening walks that Hank first became aware of Marcus Webb's increased attention. Webb owned the adjacent property, 15 acres of pasture and woodland that bordered Hank's eastern fence line. In the 4 months since the puppy's arrival, Webb had made increasingly frequent appearances at their shared property line, always finding reasons to check his fence posts or examine his livestock precisely when Hank was outside with the dogs. Webb was a man in his late 40s, weathered by outdoor work and personal hardships that he wore like armor against the world. His wife had left him several years earlier under circumstances that generated whispers throughout the county, and he'd lived alone since then with only his cattle for company. Their interactions had been limited to polite nods and brief conversations about weather or property boundaries, the kind of neighborly relationship that rural communities maintained out of necessity rather than genuine friendship. But something about the dogs had changed Webb's demeanor. Hank had noticed the way his neighbor's jaw tightened whenever Rex barked, how Webb's eyes followed the puppy's movements with an intensity that seemed disproportionate to curiosity. When Scout had once escaped through a gap in the fence and wandered onto Webb's property, Webb's reaction had been swift and hostile, returning the puppy with a lecture about controlling dangerous animals that had puzzled Hank at the time. Now, with the dogs gone, Webb's surveillance had become more obvious. Hank would spot him standing motionless near the fence line, watching the empty yard as if expecting the puppies to materialize from memory. When Hank worked in Dorothy's garden, he could feel Webb's gaze boring into his back from across the pasture. The attention felt predatory in a way that made Hank's skin crawl with unease. The mystery deepened when Sheriff Tom Bradley stopped by on a humid Thursday afternoon, his patrol car kicking up dust clouds as he navigated Hank's gravel driveway. Tom was an old friend, someone who'd known both Hank and Dorothy since their teaching days, and his visits were usually social calls accompanied by Dorothy's favorite coffee cake and updates on county happenings. This visit felt different from the moment Tom removed his hat and settled heavily into the porch rocker that had once been Dorothy's favorite spot. His weathered face carried the weight of unpleasant news, and his usual easy smile was nowhere to be found. Hank, I need to ask you about something, and I want you to know I'm not accusing you of anything, Tom began, his voice carrying the careful neutrality that 25 years of law enforcement had taught him. We've had some reports about dogs in the area. Missing dogs, to be specific. The words hit Hank like a physical blow. Missing how? 12 dogs in the past 6 months, all well cared for pets, all disappeared without a trace from their own yards. Tom pulled out a small notebook and flipped through several pages. Golden retriever named Buddy belonged to the Johnsons. Beagle mix called Princess, the Martinez family's pet. Lab shepherd cross named Duke disappeared from the Parker place just last week. Hank felt his stomach drop at the name Duke, remembering Dorothy's childhood stories about her beloved German shepherd. Tom, you can't think I had anything to do with— I don't, Tom interrupted firmly. But I have to follow every lead, talk to everyone who's had dogs in the area recently. Your puppies were visible from the road. People knew about them. I'm hoping maybe you saw something, noticed anything unusual. The conversation that followed was thorough but friendly, with Tom asking detailed questions about any suspicious vehicles, unfamiliar people, or strange behavior Hank might have observed. As they talked, Hank found himself thinking about Webb's intense interest in the puppies, the way his neighbor had seemed almost relieved when the dogs were relocated. "There is one thing," Hank said slowly, describing Webb's surveillance and hostile reaction to Scout's fence line adventure. "Probably nothing, but it struck me as odd at the time." Tom made careful notes, his expression unreadable. "Marcus Webb's had some troubles over the years. Lost his boy in a tragic accident, wife left him not long after. Sometimes grief changes people in ways that aren't healthy." The reference to a lost child sent chills down Hank's spine, but Tom didn't elaborate, and small-town courtesy prevented Hank from pressing for details. After Tom left, promising to increase patrol presence in the area, Hank found himself viewing his neighbor's behavior through a darker lens. That evening, as he sat alone on his porch watching the sunset paint the Georgia sky in shades of amber and rose, Hank's phone rang with a number he recognized immediately. Jake's voice carried excitement and confusion in equal measure. "Mr. Morrison, the strangest thing has happened. Rex showed up at the Miller place this morning, but he wasn't alone. Bella was with him, and they had Scout in tow. All 3 families called me within an hour of each other." Hank's heart leaped with a mixture of joy and concern. "Are they hurt? How did they find each other? That's the mystery." "The Millers live 30 miles northeast of you, the Chens are 40 miles southwest, and the Hendersons are 25 miles due west. There's no logical way those dogs could have coordinated a meeting, much less navigated back to a central location." The implications sent shivers through Hank's chest. German shepherds were known for their intelligence and loyalty, but this behavior suggested something beyond ordinary canine capabilities. What do the families want to do? That's the other strange part. All 3 families called to ask the same question. Would you be willing to take the dogs back? They said the puppies have been restless since the separation, refusing to settle in their new homes, always looking toward the horizon as if searching for something. As Jake's words sank in, Hank felt pieces of his fractured heart beginning to reassemble. The dogs had chosen him, just as he had chosen them during Rex's illness. Whatever bond had formed between them during those early months was strong enough to overcome distance, time, and the well-meaning interference of human logic. "Bring them home, Jake," Hank said, his voice thick with emotion. "Bring my family home." But even as he spoke the words, Hank couldn't shake the feeling that Marcus Webb's watchful presence across the fence line had grown more ominous during the dog's absence. Something was building in his neighbor's silence, something that might threaten the reunion he'd been granted against all odds. The December air carried a bite that reminded Hank of mortality as he stood in his kitchen staring at the evidence spread across Dorothy's old dining table. 3 months had passed since Rex, Bella, and Scout had returned to their chosen home, and in that time, the mystery of missing dogs had transformed from concerning coincidence into horrifying pattern. What Sheriff Bradley had initially described as 12 missing pets had grown to 23 confirmed disappearances, each one following the same disturbing trajectory. The dogs weren't simply vanishing, they were being systematically eliminated. Hank had discovered this truth in the most mundane way possible while taking his weekly trash to the county dump. Marcus Webb's pickup had been parked near the industrial dumpsters, and something about his neighbor's furtive behavior had triggered Hank's teacher instincts, the same radar that had detected cheating students and hidden problems for 40 years. Webb hadn't noticed Hank's presence as he disposed of several heavy-duty trash bags, handling them with the careful precision of someone performing a ritual. After Webb drove away, curiosity had compelled Hank to investigate. What he found in those hastily discarded bags would haunt his sleep for weeks to come. Empty antifreeze containers, methodically cleaned and labeled with dates spanning the past 2 years, each one marked with a dog's name in Webb's meticulous handwriting. Princess, Martinez family, Duke, Parker Place, Buddy, the Johnsons, name after name, date after date. A ledger of systematic murder that painted Webb not as a grief-stricken man, but as something far more dangerous. The evidence suggested a pattern of escalation, with Webb's kills becoming more frequent and his methods more refined over time. Hank's hands trembled as he arranged the containers on Dorothy's table, creating a timeline that revealed the full scope of his neighbor's obsession. The earliest container dated back 3 years, suggesting Webb's killing spree had begun long before Rex, Bella, and Scout entered Hank's life, but the frequency had increased dramatically in recent months, coinciding exactly with the period when Hank's puppies had been most visible from the road. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Webb had been building toward something larger, using the other dogs as practice for a more significant target. Hank's beloved German Shepherds hadn't just been random victims in Webb's twisted campaign. They had been the ultimate prize, the dogs whose elimination would deliver the most devastating blow to someone Webb viewed as an enemy. But why? What had Hank done to earn such focused hatred from a man he barely knew? The answer came with another discovery, this one hidden in Webb's own trash. A collection of newspaper clippings about the dog's rescue, their temporary placement with other families, and their remarkable return to Hank's homestead. Webb had been documenting their story with the obsessive attention of someone planning a military campaign. Among the clippings, Hank found something that stopped his heart, a faded photograph of a young boy, perhaps 8 years old, standing beside a German Shepherd that bore a striking resemblance to Rex. The child's face glowed with innocent joy, his small arms wrapped around the dog's thick neck in a pose that spoke of absolute trust and love. On the back, someone had written in a woman's handwriting, "Tommy and Max, Summer 2009. The pieces began assembling themselves into a picture too horrible to fully comprehend. Webb had lost a child, a son who had owned a German Shepherd. Something about that loss had twisted Webb's grief into a weapon aimed at anyone who dared to experience the joy he had been denied. Hank represented everything Webb had lost. An elderly man finding purpose and family in the love of dogs, living the happy ending that Webb's own story had been denied. The sound of a vehicle in his driveway interrupted Hank's investigation. He quickly gathered the evidence, stuffing it into a paper bag just as headlights swept across his kitchen window. Through the glass, he could see Webb's pickup truck parked in his driveway, the engine still running as if ready for quick escape. Webb's knock on the front door came with the measured rhythm of someone trying to appear casual while harboring deadly intent. When Hank opened the door, He found his neighbor wearing an expression of forced neighborliness that didn't reach his cold eyes. "Evening, Hank," Webb said, his voice carrying the artificial warmth of a salesman. "Saw your lights on, thought I'd stop by and chat." "Little late for social calls, isn't it, Marcus?" Hank replied, keeping his own voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. Every instinct screamed danger, but confronting Webb directly seemed like the fastest way to escalate whatever game his neighbor was playing. Webb's smile grew wider, revealing teeth that seemed too sharp in the porch light. "Time's funny thing, isn't it? Sometimes you run out of it faster than you expect." He gestured toward the dark yard where Rex, Bella, and Scout were presumably sleeping in their outdoor shelter. "Those dogs of yours sure have made quite a name for themselves around the county. People talk about them like they're some kind of miracle." "They're good dogs," Hank said carefully, his hand resting on the doorframe in a position that would allow him to slam it quickly if necessary. "Good dogs," Webb repeated, tasting the words like they left a bitter flavor in his mouth. "Funny how some people get blessed with good dogs while others—" His voice trailed off, but his eyes never left Hank's face. "You know, I had a good dog once. German Shepherd, just like yours. Beautiful animal. Loyal as the day is long." The reference to his lost dog sent chills through Hank's chest, confirming his worst suspicions about the photograph he'd found. "What happened to him?" Webb's expression shifted, revealing glimpses of the broken man beneath the predatory facade. "Max, he got old, got sick. Vet said the kindest thing would be to put him down." Webb's voice dropped to a whisper. "Funny thing about vets, though, they can put down a perfectly healthy dog just as easy as a sick one, if you know the right words to say." The implication hung between them like a loaded weapon. Webb wasn't just admitting to killing other people's dogs, he was confessing to murdering his own pet, the companion who had shared his son's affection and represented the last connection to his lost child. "Marcus," Hank said slowly, "maybe you should talk to someone about this. Pastor Williams at the Methodist Church, or Dr. Chen in town. Grief can make us do things we never thought possible." Webb's laugh carried no humor, only the hollow sound of a man who had traveled too far down a dark path to find his way back. "Grief? Is that what you think this is?" He stepped closer to the door, forcing Hank to resist the urge to retreat. "This isn't grief, Hank. This is justice. This is making sure that other people don't get to keep what I was forced to give up." The conversation that followed would replay in Hank's memory with crystal clarity for years to come. Webb's voice remained conversational, almost friendly, as he outlined his philosophy of equalizing suffering. He spoke of watching families enjoy their pets' unconditional love while he lived with the empty silence that followed voluntary euthanasia. He described the satisfaction he felt when other dog owners experienced the same devastating loss that had hollowed out his own life. 23 dogs, Hank," Webb said with the pride of a man recounting professional achievements. 23 families who now understand what it feels like to lose something they thought would be with them forever. "And my dogs?" Hank asked, though he already knew the answer. Webb's smile returned, colder than the December air. "Your dogs are special, Hank. They represent something more than just pets. They're symbols of hope, of second chances, of all the things people believe in when they want to feel good about the world." He paused, savoring the moment. Breaking that kind of faith requires a more personal touch. The threat was clear, but Webb wasn't finished. He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small plastic bottle, the kind used for eye drops or travel-sized medications. "Antifreeze is too quick, too merciful for what your dogs represent. I've been experimenting with other methods, slower-acting poisons that allow for more appreciation of the process." Hank's teacher instincts kicked in, the same calm authority that had faced down aggressive parents and hostile administrators for 4 decades. "Marcus, I'm going to ask you to leave my property now. If you come back here or if anything happens to my dogs, I'll be calling Sheriff Bradley." Webb's expression shifted again, this time revealing the raw fury that had been simmering beneath his manufactured civility. "You think Tom Bradley scares me? You think anyone in this pathetic county has the spine to stop what needs to be done?" He leaned forward, close enough that Hank could smell the alcohol on his breath. "I've been planning this for months, Hank. Your dogs, your precious family, they're going to disappear just like all the others. But you're going to watch it happen." The ultimatum came with the precision of a man who had rehearsed this moment many times. Hank had 24 hours to remove Rex, Bella, and Scout from the county permanently, or Webb would ensure their deaths were as prolonged and agonizing as possible. Christmas Eve, Webb explained with twisted irony, seemed like the perfect time for such a gift. As Webb's truck disappeared into the December darkness, Hank stood on his porch with Dorothy's wedding ring heavy on his finger and his heart hammering against his ribs. Tomorrow was December 23rd, which meant he had less than 24 hours to save the 3 creatures who had become his reason for living. But even as fear coursed through his veins, Hank felt something else stirring. The same fierce protectiveness that had driven him to pawn Dorothy's ring for Rex's medical bills. Webb had made a critical error in his twisted calculations. He had threatened the one thing that could transform a gentle retired teacher into something far more dangerous. Some bonds, Hank realized, were worth fighting for, regardless of the cost. Christmas Eve arrived with the deceptive tranquility of a snow globe before the shaking begins. Hank had spent the previous 24 hours in a state of hypervigilance, checking locks, watching windows, and keeping Rex, Bella, and Scout close to the house despite their obvious confusion at the sudden restriction of their freedom. He'd called Sheriff Bradley 3 times, leaving increasingly desperate messages about Webb's threats, but Tom was dealing with a multi-car accident on the interstate and hadn't returned the calls. The irony wasn't lost on Hank that he was spending what might be his last Christmas Eve in a state of siege, barricaded in the home where he and Dorothy had celebrated 53 joyous holidays together. The tree they'd planted as newlyweds now towered over the house, its branches heavy with ice that caught the porch light like crystalline memories. Dorothy's Christmas decorations, carefully preserved and displayed each year since her death, seemed to mock his current predicament with their cheerful promise of peace on earth. At 8 o'clock, as the sun set behind clouds pregnant with snow, Hank's landline rang with the sharp urgency of bad news. The voice on the other end belonged to Mrs. Patterson, his elderly neighbor 2 miles down the county road, and her words sent ice through his veins that had nothing to do with the weather. "Hank, honey, I hate to bother you on Christmas Eve, but something terrible has happened. Someone broke into our barn and poisoned our old collie, Shep. Tom Bradley's here now, and he says you need to know that whoever did this is escalating." The news hit Hank like a physical blow. Shep Patterson had been a fixture in the community for 12 years, a gentle giant who greeted every visitor with a wagging tail and had never shown aggression toward anything larger than a squirrel. Webb's decision to kill the old dog on Christmas Eve wasn't random. It was a message, a demonstration of his willingness to destroy anything that brought joy to others. "Mrs. Patterson, please tell Sheriff Bradley that Marcus Webb threatened my dogs yesterday. He gave me until tonight to get rid of them, or—" Hank's voice trailed off, unable to voice the rest of Webb's promise. "Oh, honey, Tom already left for your place. He said something about checking on you before heading home to his family." The relief Hank felt at this news was short-lived, lasting only until he realized that Webb might view law enforcement presence as an escalation requiring immediate response. If Webb was watching the house, and Hank had no doubt that he was, Sheriff Bradley's arrival might trigger whatever violent plan his neighbor had been developing. Hank moved through his house, turning off lights, creating the illusion of a normal Christmas Eve bedtime routine while actually preparing for what felt increasingly like a siege. He'd moved Rex, Bella, and Scout into the house despite their size, unwilling to leave them vulnerable in their outdoor shelter. The dogs seemed to sense the tension, remaining alert and positioned near windows as if they too understood that danger was approaching. At 9:30, Hank heard the crunch of gravel that announced Sheriff Bradley's arrival. Through his darkened living room window, he watched Tom's patrol car navigate the driveway, its headlights sweeping across the yard and momentarily illuminating Webb's truck parked in the tree line beyond Hank's property boundary. The sight of that pickup sitting motionless in the shadows sent adrenaline surging through Hank's system. Sheriff Bradley knocked with the measured authority of someone who took his duties seriously, even on Christmas Eve. When Hank opened the door, he found his old friend looking grim and tired, his uniform wrinkled from what had clearly been a long day of dealing with other people's emergencies. "Hank, we need to talk," Tom said without preamble. "I got your messages, and after what happened to Shep Patterson tonight, I'm taking Webb's threats very seriously." They sat in Hank's darkened living room, speaking in low voices, while the three dogs maintained their vigil by the windows. Tom's investigation had uncovered disturbing details about Webb's psychological state and his escalating pattern of animal killings. A search warrant executed that afternoon had revealed a workshop behind Webb's house containing detailed journals documenting each dog's death, along with photographs that suggested Webb derived satisfaction from his victim's suffering. "The district attorney wants to arrest him tonight," Tom explained, "but we can't locate him. His truck's been spotted in 3 different locations since sunset, and witnesses describe him as agitated, possibly intoxicated." Tom paused, meeting Hank's eyes in the dim light. "I need you to consider leaving for the night, taking the dog somewhere safe until we can bring Webb in." Before Hank could respond, the sound of breaking glass from the kitchen shattered the quiet conversation. Both men froze as the acrid smell of gasoline began permeating the house, followed by the distinctive whiff of flames catching hold. Rex, Bella, and Scout erupted in simultaneous barking as smoke began drifting under the kitchen door. "He's trying to burn us out," Tom said, already reaching for his radio to call for backup and the volunteer fire department. But as he raised the device to his lips, the front window exploded inward, sending glass shards across the living room floor. A second Molotov cocktail landed among Dorothy's Christmas decorations, instantly transforming the peaceful holiday scene into an inferno of memory and tradition. Through the smoke and chaos, Webb's voice carried from the yard with the hollow authority of madness. "Come out, Hank. Bring those dogs out here so we can end this properly." Sheriff Bradley drew his service weapon, positioning himself between Hank and the shattered window. "Marcus Webb, this is Sheriff Bradley. You're under arrest. Drop your weapons and surrender immediately." Webb's laughter echoed through the December night, carrying no humor, only the brittle sound of a man who had passed beyond caring about consequences. "Arrest? Tom, you don't understand what's happening here. This isn't about law and order. This is about justice. This is about making sure Hank Morrison learns what loss really means." The house filled with smoke as fires caught hold in multiple rooms, forcing the small group toward the back door. Hank's heart broke as he watched Dorothy's carefully preserved Christmas memories dissolve into ash and flame, but survival demanded movement. Rex, Bella, and Scout pressed close to his legs, their training keeping them calm despite the chaos erupting around them. As they reached the kitchen door, Tom grabbed Hank's arm. "When we go out there, stay low and head for my patrol car. I'll cover you, but Webb's armed and positioned somewhere in the yard." The back door opened onto a scene from a nightmare. Webb had positioned himself near the old oak tree where Rex loved to rest, a hunting rifle cradled in his arms and his face illuminated by the growing flames from the house. In the firelight, his expression revealed the complete dissolution of sanity, replaced by something primal and infinitely dangerous. "Merry Christmas, Hank," Webb called out, his voice carrying across the yard with terrible clarity. "I brought you a present, the same gift I got 3 years ago when I had to watch my boy die. Tonight, you get to watch your family burn." The moment Sheriff Bradley stepped into Webb's line of fire, the rifle cracked through the December night with the finality of judgment. Tom spun and dropped, his right shoulder blossoming red as he fell behind his patrol car, his service weapon clattering across the frozen ground beyond reach. Hank felt his world tilt as his oldest friend crumpled, leaving him alone to face a madman whose grief had transformed into something monstrous and unstoppable. "That's what happens when people interfere with destiny," Webb called out, working the bolt action to chamber another round. The firelight dancing across his face revealed eyes that no longer held any trace of the neighbor Hank had known, replaced by the hollow stare of someone who had surrendered his humanity piece by piece over 3 years of systematic murder. Hank knelt beside Tom, pressing his hands against the bleeding wound while the sheriff fought to remain conscious. "Tom, stay with me," Hank whispered, but he could see the pallor spreading across his friend's face as shock began setting in. The nearest hospital was 25 miles away, and with Webb controlling the yard, calling for an ambulance had become a death sentence for whoever responded. Behind them, the house that had sheltered 53 years of marriage was being consumed with methodical efficiency. Webb had planned this assault with military precision, using multiple ignition points to ensure the fire would spread too quickly for the volunteer fire department to contain. Dorothy's kitchen, where she had prepared thousands of meals with love and laughter, was already lost. The living room where they had exchanged Christmas gifts and hosted family gatherings was collapsing into itself, sending sparks spiraling into the night sky like burning prayers. Rex, Bella, and Scout remained pressed against Hank's legs, their training keeping them steady despite every instinct screaming at them to flee. But Hank could see the tension in their powerful frames, the way their ears swiveled toward every sound Webb made as he repositioned himself for a clearer shot. These dogs had been bred for protection, shaped by generations of selective breeding to guard what they loved most. The only thing keeping them from attacking was Hank's presence and the authority he had established during their puppyhood. "You know what the beautiful thing about this moment is, Hank?" Webb's voice carried the conversational tone of a man discussing weather, as if he weren't holding 3 lives at gunpoint while a house burned behind them. "This is exactly how it felt when I had to make the decision about my boy. The doctors, they gave me all these statistics, all these medical terms, but it came down to one simple choice: let him suffer or end his pain." The revelation hit Hank like a physical blow. Webb hadn't lost his son to a dog attack. He had lost him to illness, to the kind of slow, agonizing disease that forced impossible decisions on loving parents. Somewhere in his grief-shattered mind, Webb had convinced himself that euthanizing Tommy had been an act of mercy, and now he was extending that same twisted compassion to others. "Marcus, your boy didn't suffer because you loved him," Hank called out, his voice carrying the authority that had once commanded classrooms full of unruly teenagers. "You gave him peace because that's what fathers do when there's no other choice. But this isn't the same thing. You're not ending suffering, you're creating it." Webb's laugh carried no humor, only the bitter sound of a man who had rehearsed this conversation in his mind countless times. "You think I don't know what I'm doing? I've had 3 years to think about this. 3 years to plan exactly how this would go. Every dog I put down taught me something new about mercy, about the clean efficiency of ending things before they get worse. The rifle swung toward Rex, and Hank felt his heart stop as Webb's finger tightened on the trigger. In that frozen moment, he understood with crystal clarity that arguing with Webb's delusions was futile. The man had traveled too far into madness to be reached by logic or compassion. Only action remained, and action meant accepting that one or all of them might not survive the next few minutes. "Rex, down!" Hank commanded, his voice cutting through the chaos with the authority that had never failed him. All three dogs dropped instantly, their training overriding their protective instincts as they pressed themselves against the frozen ground. The movement saved Rex's life as Webb's shot passed through the space where the dog's head had been a split second earlier. Sheriff Bradley stirred behind the patrol car, his good hand fumbling for his radio despite the blood loss that was rapidly weakening him. "All units, officer down at Morrison Place, suspect armed and dangerous. Send everything you've got," he managed to gasp before the radio slipped from his fingers. Webb heard the transmission and understood its implications. Backup was coming, probably within minutes, which meant his carefully orchestrated plan was about to be interrupted by the kind of law enforcement response that would end in his own death or capture. The realization seemed to energize him rather than discourage him, as if the approaching deadline only added urgency to his mission. "Time's running out, Hank," Webb called, already moving to a new position that would give him a clear shot at all three dogs simultaneously. "I wanted to do this slowly, wanted you to understand what you were losing, but we're going to have to speed things up." The sound of sirens in the distance confirmed what they all knew. The volunteer fire department and additional law enforcement were racing through the December night toward a confrontation that would define the rest of their lives. But sirens were still minutes away, and minutes might as well have been hours when measured against the distance between Webb's rifle and the three hearts that had become Hank's entire reason for living. In that moment of absolute clarity that sometimes precedes desperate action, Hank made a decision that would have horrified Dorothy even as she understood its necessity. Rising from his crouch behind the patrol car, he stepped into the open ground between Webb and his dogs, placing his 75-year-old body between the rifle and the creatures he had sworn to protect. "If you want them, Marcus, you'll have to go through me first," Hank said, his voice steady despite the terror coursing through his veins. "And if you kill me, those dogs are going to tear you apart before you can work that bolt action again." Webb's expression shifted as he realized the trap Hank had set. Killing Hank would indeed release the dogs from their training, transforming them from obedient pets into 200 pounds of protective fury. But letting Hank live meant accepting defeat, abandoning the mission that had consumed 3 years of careful planning. The standoff stretched between them like a taut wire, measured in heartbeats and breathing while the house collapsed further into itself behind them. Webb's finger rested on the trigger, his rifle aimed at Hank's chest, while Rex, Bella, and Scout remained motionless on the ground, waiting for the command that would either save them or release them to avenge their fallen protector. In the distance, the sirens grew louder, accompanied by the rumble of multiple vehicles racing down the county road. Help was coming, but whether it would arrive in time depended entirely on what choice Webb made in the next few seconds. 3 years of accumulated madness balanced against the approaching sound of justice, while a 75-year-old man stood between his family and annihilation, protected only by his faith that love could triumph over the darkest impulses of human nature. Webb's eyes met Hank's across the frozen yard, and in that moment, both men understood that everything they had ever believed about courage, sacrifice, and the bonds that make life worth living was about to be tested in the most fundamental way possible. The rifle barrel wavered slightly as Webb's resolve faltered, but his finger remained on the trigger, and the night held its breath while destiny prepared to reveal which force would prove stronger, the destructive power of unhealed grief or the protective instinct of unconditional love. The moment Webb's rifle discharged, time fractured into a series of impossibly slow images that would replay in Hank's memory for the rest of his life. The muzzle flash illuminated the yard in stark black and white, freezing Webb's twisted expression of triumph as the bullet tore through the December air. But Hank remained standing, untouched, his heart hammering against his ribs as he realized Webb's shot had gone wide, thrown off by the tremor in hands that had consumed too much alcohol to steady his aim. Before Webb could work the bolt action for another round, 3 shadows erupted from the frozen ground with the synchronized precision of a military operation. Rex reached Webb first, 110 pounds of muscle and protective fury launching through the air with the speed that had made German Shepherds the preferred breed of law enforcement agencies worldwide. His massive jaws clamped down on Webb's rifle arm, not to kill but to disable, exactly as his breeding and training had programmed him to do. Bella flanked left while Scout circled right, their movements coordinated by instincts that ran deeper than training, deeper than individual thought. They had become a pack in the truest sense, united by their shared love for the man who had saved them from death as puppies, and was now risking his own life to save them again. Webb's screams filled the night as he went down under their combined weight, the rifle flying from his grasp to land harmlessly in the snow-covered flower bed, where Dorothy's roses lay dormant beneath winter's protection. The dogs held Webb down, but didn't maul him, demonstrating the discipline that separated trained protection animals from wild predators. Rex maintained his grip on Webb's arm while Bella and Scout positioned themselves to prevent escape, their low growls vibrating through the frozen air like promises of what would happen if Webb moved wrong. They had neutralized the threat without becoming killers themselves, honoring the trust Hank had placed in them during months of patient training. Sheriff Bradley's backup arrived in a cacophony of sirens and flashing lights, 4 patrol cars and a fire truck converging on the scene with the controlled chaos of emergency responders who had drilled for exactly this kind of situation. The volunteer firefighters immediately began attacking the blaze consuming Hank's house, but it was clear that the structure was beyond saving. 53 years of accumulated memories were disappearing into smoke and ash, leaving only the foundation where a life had been built brick by brick. Paramedics rushed to Sheriff Bradley's side, working to stabilize his condition for transport to the regional hospital, while deputies secured Webb and the crime scene. The killer of 23 innocent animals lay motionless beneath Rex's watchful guard, his right arm shattered and his spirit finally broken by the confrontation with consequences he had never anticipated. As the immediate crisis subsided and Webb was loaded into an ambulance under heavy guard, Dr. Jake Sullivan arrived in his pickup truck, drawn by reports of the fire and his concern for his former teacher. Jake had been monitoring police frequencies since hearing about the escalating threats against Hank, and he'd driven through the night from 3 counties over to offer whatever help he could provide. "Mr. Morrison, are you hurt?" Jake asked, performing a quick medical assessment while the dogs remained alert but calm around their familiar veterinarian. "When I heard Webb had snapped, I was afraid we might lose all of you." Hank shook his head, still processing the surreal nature of his survival. An hour ago he had been preparing for what seemed like certain death, and now he stood in his yard watching strangers extinguish the last remnants of his physical past, while his 3 guardian angels remained protectively close. The dogs showed no signs of injury from their confrontation with Webb, though Rex's muzzle bore traces of blood that didn't belong to him. "They saved my life, Jake," Hank said, his voice thick with emotion as he knelt to embrace each dog in turn. "I don't know how they knew when to act, but they moved like they'd been planning this their whole lives." The investigation that followed would reveal the full scope of Webb's deteriorating mental state and the systematic nature of his crimes. In his house, deputies found journals documenting not just the dogs he had killed, but detailed surveillance notes about their owners, their daily routines, and their emotional attachments to their pets. Webb had studied his victims with the thoroughness of a behavioral scientist, learning exactly how to inflict maximum psychological damage through the loss of beloved companions. The truth about Webb's son Tommy emerged through medical records and interviews with his ex-wife, who had been living in another state under her maiden name since leaving Webb 5 years earlier. Tommy had indeed died young, but not from any dog attack. He had succumbed to leukemia after a 2-year battle that had drained the family's finances and emotional reserves. Webb's decision to euthanize his own dog Max had come 3 months after Tommy's death, when the sight of the German Shepherd had become an unbearable reminder of his son's absence. Susan Webb, reached by phone at her sister's house in Tennessee, provided crucial context for her ex-husband's descent into madness. Marcus couldn't handle Tommy's death, she explained to investigators through tears that had been 5 years in the making. He started seeing threats everywhere, convinced that other families didn't deserve to be happy when we had lost everything. When he killed Max, I knew he was beyond help. The psychological evaluation that followed Webb's arrest painted a picture of a man whose grief had metastasized into something malignant and destructive. Dr. Sarah Chen, the psychiatrist assigned to assess his competency for trial, diagnosed him with complicated grief disorder compounded by delusional thinking and alcohol dependency. Webb had constructed an elaborate fantasy in which eliminating other people's joy could somehow balance the cosmic scales that had taken his son. But perhaps the most shocking revelation came when investigators discovered Webb's intended finale. Hidden in his workshop, they found detailed plans for a Christmas Day assault on the county animal shelter, where he had planned to poison every dog in the facility using a combination of antifreeze and rat poison mixed into the animals' food. His journals indicated that he viewed the shelter dogs as future heartbreak for unsuspecting families, and that their elimination would be his greatest gift to the community. The scope of the tragedy Webb had planned sent shockwaves through Millbrook County and beyond. National news outlets picked up the story of the man who had declared war on human-animal bonds, turning Hank and his dogs into symbols of resilience in the face of inexplicable evil. Letters of support arrived from across the country, along with donations to help rebuild Hank's house and support his continuing care of Rex, Bella, and Scout. 3 months after the confrontation, as spring began returning to Georgia and Hank prepared to break ground on a new house built on the same foundation where he and Dorothy had shared their life together, he received an unexpected visitor. Webb's ex-wife Susan had driven down from Tennessee, carrying a box of photographs and a request that would test Hank's capacity for forgiveness. "I know this is asking too much," Susan said as they sat on the temporary porch of Hank's FEMA trailer, watching Rex play with a rope toy in the yard where the old oak tree still stood unmarked by fire. "But I have pictures of Tommy with Max, and I think Marcus needs to remember what love looks like instead of focusing on what loss feels like." The photographs Susan shared revealed a different side of the Webb family story. Tommy had been a vibrant child whose face lit up whenever Max was near. The German Shepherd had been his constant companion, sleeping beside his bed during the worst nights of chemotherapy, providing comfort that no human could offer during the long battle against leukemia. "Max died because Marcus couldn't bear to look at him," Susan explained, her voice breaking as she spoke about decisions that had haunted her for 5 years. "But Tommy would have wanted Max to live, to find another family to love. My boy understood that love doesn't die when people do. It just finds new places to grow." That afternoon, accompanied by Sheriff Bradley, who had recovered from his shoulder wound, Hank made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. He drove to the county jail where Webb was awaiting trial. carrying one of the photographs Susan had shared, a picture of 8-year-old Tommy laughing as Max licked his face, both boy and dog radiating the pure joy that defines perfect friendship. The meeting took place in a sterile visitation room that smelled of industrial disinfectant and human desperation. Webb looked smaller than Hank remembered, diminished by orange jail clothing and the weight of consequences he was finally beginning to comprehend. When Hank placed the photograph on the table between them, Webb's eyes filled with tears that had been 5 years in coming. "He loved that dog," Webb whispered, touching the photograph with trembling fingers. Max was the only thing that could make Tommy smile during the worst days. "Then why did you kill him?" Hank asked, his voice gentle but direct. Webb's breakdown was complete and devastating, years of suppressed grief pouring out in heaving sobs that shook his entire frame. "Because every time I looked at Max, I saw Tommy, and I couldn't handle seeing happiness when my boy was gone forever." The conversation that followed lasted 2 hours and changed both men in ways they couldn't have anticipated. Hank shared stories about Rex, Bella, and Scout, about how loving them had helped him process his own grief over losing Dorothy. Webb listened with the attention of a man desperate for absolution, gradually understanding that his campaign of destruction had been aimed at the very thing that might have saved him. When Hank finally left the jail, he carried with him a promise from Webb to testify truthfully about his crimes and to seek the psychological help that might prevent other families from experiencing similar tragedy. It wasn't forgiveness, exactly. Some actions stretched beyond the boundaries of human absolution, but it was recognition that even the darkest hearts could still house fragments of the love that had created them. 6 months later, as Hank stood in the kitchen of his rebuilt house watching Rex, Bella, and Scout play in Dorothy's restored garden, he reflected on the strange journey that had brought them all to this moment of peace. The dogs had grown into magnificent adults, their bond with each other and with him deeper than anything he could have imagined when Jake first brought 3 orphaned puppies to his door. Dorothy's photograph smiled down from its place of honor on the new mantelpiece, surrounded by pictures of the dogs at various stages of their development. Hank often talked to her image, sharing the small victories and daily joys that filled his life now. Sometimes he imagined he could hear her laughter mixing with the dogs' contented sighs as they settled around his chair each evening. The scars would always remain, the memory of flames consuming 5 decades of accumulated memories, the sound of Webb's rifle cracking through the Christmas Eve air, the sight of Sheriff Bradley bleeding in the snow. But scars were proof of survival, evidence that love could endure even the most determined attempts to destroy it. As evening settled over the Georgia countryside and the dogs claimed their usual positions around his recliner, Hank opened Dorothy's Bible to a verse that had sustained him through the darkest nights. "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him." The words had never seemed more true than they did in this moment, surrounded by the living proof that grace could transform even the most broken circumstances into something beautiful and whole. Outside his window, the stars emerged one by one in the clear night sky, and Hank Morrison smiled as he realized that sometimes the family you're meant to have arrives in ways you never could have planned or predicted. Love, he had learned, was indeed the force that made all things possible, even redemption for the most shattered hearts. Sometimes the most profound love stories aren't written in wedding vows or anniversary cards. They're lived out in the quiet moments when we choose to open our hearts again after loss has left us feeling empty and forgotten. Hank Morrison thought his capacity for family had died with Dorothy, that at 75 his story was essentially over. But 3 orphaned puppies taught him that love doesn't have expiration dates, and that the courage to care again can transform not just our own lives, but create ripples of healing that extend far beyond what we can imagine. When Rex, Bella, and Scout chose to risk everything to save the man who had saved them, they proved that the bonds we forge through acts of compassion become unbreakable threads that connect us across time and circumstance. Dorothy's dream of having children was finally fulfilled, just not in the way anyone expected. The greatest families aren't always born. Sometimes they're rescued, one broken heart at a time, by souls brave enough to believe that love multiplies when you share it freely. Have you ever experienced an unexpected relationship that healed a part of your heart you thought was permanently broken? What would you tell someone who believes they're too old to start loving again? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.